Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. Today we're going global, kinda.
Yeah, going global, but thinking local.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're diving deep today into global supply chains.
Which, if you think about it, touch nearly every item we purchase. I mean, here in the USA especially.
Yeah, I mean, right here in Southeast Houston, think about it.
You got it.
Your T-shirt
From Deer Park.
to your phone, over in LaPorte,
Absolutely.
and just the incredible variety of products we see every day, even in a place like Pasadena, is all tied to this massive global web of interconnected systems.
These supply chains.
Supply chains. So today we're specifically trying to get a better grasp on the human side of things within this complex network.
Yeah, we're focusing on the labor practices of two major players. Shein, which, many of you might recognize as that super popular online fast fashion platform, and Foxconn.
Right.
And Foxconn's a little different, kind of a behind-the-scenes giant that makes components for so many of the electronics we use every day.
So we've got this consumer advocacy report that's helped us dig deep into their supply chains.
Yeah, it's pretty eye-opening stuff.
Really is. Now, for us here in Southeast Houston, whether you're in Deer Park, LaPorte, or Pasadena, understanding where the products we use come from, well, it's not just about, being curious.
Right.
It's also about having the knowledge to maybe make choices that reflect what we believe in. And maybe, just maybe, make a positive impact, even in a small way, through what we buy every day.
Yeah, making a difference with your wallet.
Exactly. Okay, so first up, let's unpack Shein a bit. It's really taken the fast fashion world by storm.
Oh, absolutely. They've really exploded, especially with younger shoppers in the US. Their model is basically, offering super affordable, trendy clothes through their online platform. And the crazy thing is how fast they update their inventory. I mean, it's like a constant flood of new styles, which keeps those bargain hunters coming back for more.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks think of them as mainly women's clothing. That's where they got their start, right?
Right.
But looking at their offerings for us here in the USA, they've got a really diverse range.
Oh, for sure.
Clothing for men, kids, you name it. And accessories, tons of them. Bags, jewelry, hats, shoes, you name it. They've even branched out into beauty products, personal care stuff. But they go way beyond just fashion, don't they?
Yeah, way beyond. You can find like a surprising amount of home goods on there, everything from decorations to kitchen stuff, even bedding. They've also got electronics, tech accessories, headphones, phone cases, all that. And if you dig around, you'll even find pet supplies, things for the office and school, tools, even some car accessories. It's kind of like a massive online department store.
Yeah, like a one-stop shop for almost everything. But, when we see those super low prices, it definitely raises some questions about the conditions where those items are actually made. What does this report tell us about the labor practices in Shein's factories, primarily in China?
Yeah, well, the report flags some pretty serious concerns. One of the biggest is the excessive working hours. We're seeing reports of garment workers clocking in something like 75 hours a week.
Wow.
Which, when you think about it, that's way over what Chinese labor laws allow. It translates to 12-hour shifts, 6, sometimes even 7 days a week. Not much time for rest. And it shows a system that puts fast production above, the well-being of the people making those clothes that end up in your closet in Deer Park.
Yeah, that paints a pretty grim picture.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine the way they're paid makes up for those kind of hours.
No, you're right. That's another major issue. The piecework system is really common in these factories. Workers are basically paid for each item they complete, not for the hours they put in. This leads to really low basic wages, often falling below what would be considered a living wage where they are. So while Shein might say their workers are earning above the minimum wage, that often relies on a ton of overtime. So it's a system that basically forces workers to endure these brutal hours just to earn, a decent income, like the kind of income you'd need to support a family right here in LaPorte.
It's a tough situation.
Yeah.
And the report also brings to light some even more disturbing stuff, right? We're talking about child labor and even allegations of forced labor.
Yeah, unfortunately, Shein themselves actually disclosed a couple of cases of child labor within their supply chain back in 2023. Now, those suppliers were temporarily suspended, but, Then there's the really serious allegations about forced labor, specifically related to cotton coming from the Xinjiang region in China.
Right.
Now, Shein's general counsel has kind of dodged direct questions on this, but the concerns are still there. And they deserve our attention, especially as consumers right here in Pasadena.
That's deeply concerning. aside from those major issues, what other challenges are workers in these factories facing?
Well, the report also highlights some pretty worrying health and safety conditions in some factories. There are accounts of verbal harassment, and the super strict quality control measures sometimes mean workers are forced to make alterations without any extra pay.
Oh, wow.
And the lack of strong labor rights organizations within these factories is also a huge problem.
Right.
It really limits the workers' ability to band together and negotiate for better treatment, safer working conditions, the kinds of rights we often take for granted here in the U.S.
So it sounds like a really tough, potentially exploitative environment for these workers.
Yeah.
And while Shein talks about their supplier code of conduct and the audits they do, the fact that these violations keep popping up really makes you wonder how effective those measures actually are and how transparent, really.
Yeah, for sure. It raises some big questions about how thorough those audits really are, whether
Yeah.
they truly reflect what's actually going on for the workers on the ground every day.
Right. Okay, let's shift gears now and talk about the electronics industry. Let's take a look at Foxconn.
Okay.
Now, unlike Shein, which is a brand we see online, Foxconn's more behind the scenes.
Right.
I bet most folks in Deer Park probably haven't bought anything directly from Foxconn.
Yeah.
But this report really highlights how important they are to the supply chains of so many tech companies whose products we use, every day here in the U.S.
Yeah, they're huge.
They're the world's largest contract electronics manufacturer.
Yeah, it's kind of technical term,
Yeah.
but it means they make or assemble parts and sometimes even entire devices for a ton of different brands.
They're kind of like the unseen giant in the electronics world.
Yeah, I like that. The unseen giant.
And the range of products they're involved in for the U.S. market, it's mind-blowing. Can you give us some specific examples of brands and products that we might recognize that likely have a connection to Foxconn?
Yeah.
I think our listeners in LaPorte and beyond would be surprised at just how far their reach extends.
Oh, absolutely. Maybe the most well-known connection is Apple.
Right.
Foxconn is a major manufacturer and assembler for iPhones, iPads, Mac computers, and even internal components for those devices. But they're not limited to Apple. They're also involved in making Sony's PlayStation consoles, Nintendo's gaming systems.
Really?
Oh, yeah, going back to the GameCube, including the DS models and even the popular Switch. Amazon's Kindles, those e-readers, and the Echo devices often have ties to Foxconn, as do Microsoft's Xboxes.
Wow, that covers a lot of the major players in tech and gaming, stuff we see all the time here in Pasadena.
And the list goes on. Big PC brands like Dell and HP use Foxconn for building complete PCs and making various parts. Remember BlackBerry smartphones?
Oh, yeah.
They were also made by Foxconn. Google's Pixel devices, networking giants like Cisco, Motorola mobility products, Roku streaming devices, and even some Vizio TV designs have connections to Foxconn. They even produced motherboards for Intel, historically, and they make routers and computer accessories for Belkin.
So, if you've got a smartphone, a gaming console, a computer, you name it, in your home in Deer Park, chances are pretty high that some part of it, or even the whole thing, was put together by Foxconn.
Yeah, that's the key takeaway.
Yeah.
Their influence in the electronics industry is immense, making them a central player in these global supply chains, even though they're often invisible, bringing all this tech to our homes.
Right. But just like with Shein's and fashion, there have been some big concerns raised about the labor practices in Foxconn's factories, which, again, are mostly located in China.
Right.
So what are some of the main labor issues that have been reported at Foxconn? Is it a similar situation to what we heard about with Shein?
Yeah, there are definitely some similarities. Excessive overtime is a big one.
Yeah.
Workers often have to work way beyond legal limits to meet those high production demands, especially when new products are launching. There's been reports of people working up to 100 hours a week at times.
100 hours.
Yeah, it's a lot. And similar to the suppliers for Shein, base wages are often reported as not being enough to cover basic living costs, meaning workers have to rely heavily on that overtime pay just to get by, in places like LaPorte.
Right.
It seems like that dependence on overtime to make a decent living, it's a troubling trend in these global manufacturing hubs.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. What about the overall working environment at Foxconn? The report mentioned this total institution structure.
Mm-hmm.
What does that even mean?
Right. So total institution, it refers to how Foxconn's, these massive factory campuses, are often set up. Workers often live in company dorms right on site, eat in company cafeterias, that kind of thing. So there's very little separation between their work life and their personal life.
Yeah.
You can kind of think of it like like self-contained mini cities built around the factories. Now, while this might seem super efficient for production, it's been criticized because it can eat into workers' personal time, their privacy, their autonomy, the things we value here in our communities in Pasadena.
It sounds really restrictive, and it must be hard to have any kind of work-life balance.
Yeah.
Were there other types of mistreatment or discrimination reported?
Sadly, yes. Reports have shown instances of discrimination during hiring based on things like ethnicity, religion, gender, even someone's perceived mood or emotional state.
Oh, wow.
The use of dispatch workers and vocational school students, sometimes in ways that might violate Chinese labor laws, has also been a big concern. And there have been reports of workplace bullying, verbal abuse from supervisors, and insufficient safety training in some facilities.
It's hard to hear about these kinds of conditions existing in places that make the products we use every single day. The report also mentioned those really tragic worker suicides back in 2010. That must have been a huge wake-up call for everyone.
It was a really dark time.
Yeah.
That series of suicides in 2010 brought a lot of global attention to the intense pressure and the harsh conditions in Foxconn factories.
Yeah.
It really showed the human cost behind all these gadgets we often take for granted.
It's a stark reminder that there are real people with real lives behind these products. So, how has Foxconn responded to these criticisms over the years? Have they actually taken steps to address these issues?
Well, both Foxconn and big clients like Apple have said publicly that they're committed to improving things for workers, and they have made some changes over time. This includes some attempts to reduce those crazy working hours and make improvements to the physical factory buildings and living conditions. Foxconn has also highlighted the independent audits they've had to show they're complying with industry standards. But much like with Shein, labor rights organizations continue to report problems, ongoing violations, suggesting that despite these efforts, there are still systemic issues within their operations.
It feels like there's often a big disconnect between the public statements and what's actually happening for many workers on the ground in these global supply chains.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
And it brings us back to, us, the consumers,
Yeah.
right here in Deer Park, LaPorte, Pasadena. Knowing all this, what can we actually do? What are some practical steps we can take? How can our choices, as consumers, possibly make a difference in these labor practices that seem so far away from our daily lives?
That's such an important question. And this is where, our actions, even locally, can have a real impact. Because while our individual choices might seem small, together they can send a strong message. So a few things we can do.
Okay, let's get specific. What's something tangible we can do right here in Southeast Houston?
One thing is to demand more transparency and information from the companies we buy from. So for Shein, there are campaigns like Fashion Revolution's #WhoMetaMyClothes, which encourage us to directly ask Shein, on social media about their manufacturing processes and the labor standards in their supply chain.
Okay.
For those bigger brands that rely on manufacturers like Foxconn, like Apple, Nintendo, Amazon, we can reach out to them directly and ask about their labor standards and how they monitor their production facilities. And supporting independent groups like China Labor Watch and Public Eye, who are doing those on-the-ground investigations and providing unbiased reporting, that's crucial for holding these companies accountable.
Right, putting pressure on the companies and supporting the groups that are uncovering these issues. So what about how we spend our money? How can we be more conscious about our purchasing power?
Oh, that's huge. When it comes to fashion, we can make an effort to find and support brands that, prioritize ethical and sustainable production, paying fair wages, and providing safe working conditions. This might mean looking beyond the rock bottom prices of ultra fast fashion and considering brands that are more transparent about their labor practices.
Cool.
And when we buy electronics, we can research companies that have a clear commitment to ethical labor practices across their supply chains, like looking for specific certifications or checking out their supplier responsibility reports. And honestly, one of the most impactful things we can do collectively is to simply buy less fast fashion and electronics.
Right.
Less demand means less pressure on manufacturers to cut corners in ways that harm workers.
So being more mindful about how much we buy and where we buy from, what else can we do to make our voices heard and push for change?
Raising awareness and advocating for changes in policy, that's key too. We can use social media to share information about labor practices at companies like Shein and Foxconn, using hashtags like #ethicalfashion or #techaccountability. Signing online petitions and supporting campaigns run by good labor rights groups can also have a big impact.
Right.
And don't underestimate the power of contacting companies directly through customer service, on social media, or even through investor relations to express your concerns and demand better practices. And finally, supporting organizations that are actively working on these issues, whether through donating or volunteering your time, can make a real difference.
Yeah. Okay, so lots of ways to get involved, even from our local communities here in Southeast Houston. Now, the report mentioned a bunch of specific organizations and campaigns right here in the USA that focus on these issues. Can you tell us more about them for those of us in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena who might want to get involved?
Oh, absolutely. There are some fantastic organizations here in the U.S. doing great work.
Yeah.
The Clean Clothes Campaign is a great example. They advocate for fair wages and safe conditions in the global garment industry. Fashion Revolution, like we talked about with the hashtag Who Mad in My Clothes campaign, they're a major force pushing for transparency and ethical practices in the fashion world. Remake, they focus specifically on garment workers' rights, campaigning for things like fair pay and better laws in the industry.
Right.
Freedom United is actively campaigning against forced labor, and they've specifically targeted companies like Shein. And there's the Stop Uyghur Genocide campaign, which raises awareness about forced labor in the Xinjiang region and its potential links to various companies, including Shein. Then there's the Shut Down Shein campaign, which is a broader effort tackling different human rights and environmental issues connected to the company. And for a wider perspective, the Fair Labor Association does independent monitoring in apparel, footwear, and even electronics, including big names like Apple and Foxconn. China Labor Watch, though based internationally, delivers those crucial on-the-ground reports from Chinese factories, including those used by Foxconn. And Students and Scholars Against Corporate Misbehavior, or SACOM, monitors supply chains with a focus on the electronics industry, including Foxconn.
Wow, so many great organizations.
Yeah, and supporting them, even in small ways, can really help amplify that consumer voice for change.
Yeah, it's really helpful to know about these groups we can connect with and support right here in the U.S. So what about the legal and regulatory side of things? Are there ways we as U.S. consumers can use those frameworks to advocate for better labor practices in these global supply chains?
Yeah, there are some legal and regulatory tools that can be useful. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or the UFLPA, is a major piece of U.S. law that bans goods from the Xinjiang region unless it can be proven they weren't made with forced labor. Consumers who suspect something might be violating this law can report it to U.S. Customs and Border Protection. The Tariff Act of 1930 also prohibits imports made with forced labor. Now, the California Transparency in Supply Chains Act, while specific to California, requires big retailers and manufacturers operating there to be transparent about their efforts to combat slavery and human trafficking in their supply chains. Those disclosures can be helpful for consumers all over the U.S. And there's also the possibility of future legislation, like the Fashion Act proposed in New York, which is aimed at more transparency in the fashion industry about their environmental and social impacts. Supporting efforts like that is important. And while taking direct legal action against factories overseas is really tough, there might be some options under state consumer protection laws if companies are found to be, lying about their labor practices. In those cases, consumers could consider filing complaints with the Federal Trade Commission. So direct legal action is often limited, but supporting the enforcement of current laws and pushing for tougher regulations by talking to our elected officials, that's how we can really drive lasting change.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we might not be able to, take a company to court from our homes in LaPorte, but we can support the laws that are trying to keep unethically made products out of our markets.
Yeah.
And we can encourage our lawmakers to create stronger, more effective rules. It really shows how connected everything is.
It really does.
So as we wrap up our deep dive here, it's clear that there are serious ongoing concerns about the labor practices involved in making the things we buy, both from companies like Shein and from those that use manufacturers like Foxconn. We've talked about those disturbing reports of crazy long hours, wages that are way too low, and the very concerning allegations of child and forced labor within Shein's supply chain. And with Foxconn, we've highlighted the long-standing problems of excessive overtime and often harsh working conditions. And despite companies saying they're making changes and doing audits, independent investigations keep finding problems.
Yeah, unfortunately.
It really shows just how complex these global supply chains are. But as this report and our discussion today highlight, we as consumers, We have some power, too.
We do.
By speaking up and demanding transparency, making more ethical choices when we shop, thinking about consuming less overall, raising awareness about these issues with the people around us, supporting organizations working to protect workers' rights, and engaging in the political process to push for better laws, we can all work together to try and make things better.
Yeah, and by becoming more informed and making conscious choices in our daily lives, both as individuals and as communities here in Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena, we can help create a more ethical and just global supply chain.
So think about those everyday decisions you make. Where you choose to shop, what you decide to buy. Could these choices, when made with more awareness and purpose, have a ripple effect and help improve the lives of workers around the world?
It's definitely something to think about.
What does it really mean for us here in Southeast Houston to think and act locally in this interconnected world?
A great question to ponder.
This has been a deep dive from Think and Act Locally, empowering residents of Deer Park, LaPorte, and Pasadena, Texas to improve their lives and community. If you find value in our show, please support us at thinkandactlocally.com/donate. Link in show notes.